Okay, we're now moving into genetics, and if you remember back to the beginning of the year, genetics is the study of heredity. Heredity is how information is passed from a parent to their offspring, how you inherit the characteristics that you have from your parents. Most of what we know about genetics comes from the work of one person, and that's kind of unusual in science. Typically, we say that science is cumulative, meaning that some scientists do some work and then the next scientist does a little more and keeps adding to it, to that, this bank of knowledge, and eventually somewhere down the road somebody kind of puts it all together and comes to a conclusion and they get the credit for it. Well, in genetics, Mendel pretty much started answering the questions and he himself came up with the answers. Mendel was born in 1822, and then you'll notice from his picture that he is a monk. Uh, he also taught school there at the monastery. Now, if you don't know anything about monasteries, the monastery of the Catholic Church, basically all the monks live at the monastery. They each have, their own room. That's their home. And the monastery is in some ways a lot like a self-contained area that they have walls around the outside of it, kind of like a fort. They grow their own food, have their own garden, have their own animals and livestock for meat, and they're the educated people of that time period. So teaching school to the local children in their town became kind of a secondary job of the monks. And Mendel was particularly good in math and science, which helped out a lot as he started asking questions about heredity. One of the other jobs that Mendel had was to grow the vegetables, control the garden of the monastery for the monks to eat. And he became particularly interested in how his plants were passing their characteristics on to the next year's plants. When he replanted the seeds, how the next year's plants grew with characteristics similar to what their parent plants had done. And he became especially interested in the traits of pea plants. Hard to believe that what we know about how you give characteristics to your children came from studying one of those little round green peas like we love to eat at lunchtime. Uh, Mendel used the pea plant and the pea plant's characteristics to explain how genetics works. And as he looked at the pea plants, he basically identified 7 traits that he was going to study. A trait is like a characteristic. And some people say Mendel was a little bit lucky, maybe it was intentional, but each of the 7 traits that Mendel chose to study only had 2 possibilities. Some of our traits might have several possibilities, like your hair color. You have red hair and blonde hair and brown hair and black hair. That's 4 possibilities just right there. Or blue eyes and green eyes and brown eyes. But with Mendel's pea plants, each trait that he picked only had 2 possibilities. So for example, the shape of the seed was a trait. And for that shape, the seeds either had to be nice and round or they were wrinkled looking. The color, the seeds were either yellow or green. We've kind of got where the plants that or the peas that we eat, we've chosen to go with the green pea color and the round shape. Maybe it's just a little more appetizing looking, etc. But there's always 2 possibilities for the trait. Flowers were either purple or white. The flower position, axial or terminal. If you look at the picture here, you'll notice terminal means out at the tips. The word terminal itself means the end, like a bus terminal is the end of the bus route. So on terminal flower plants, the flowers were always at the ends of the stem. On axial plants, everywhere that the stem might fork would form a place that the flower would grow. Pod color, kind of like the peas, could be either green or yellow. Pod shape, inflated like a balloon, kind of blown up. You can't really see the peas inside of it. or constricted. Constrict means to squeeze, and with the constricted pods, that means that you could kind of count the peas inside the pod without opening it up. And then the height of the plant. Some of the plants grew very tall, and some stayed relatively short. In each of the characteristics of these plants, the plant can only have one from each trait. So you'd never see both yellow and green peas on the same plant. It's either got green peas or it's got yellow peas. It's either got inflated pods or constricted pods, never both. But you can mix and match in any combination you wanted to with the pea plant. You could have yellow seeds that were round, that from a plant that had purple flowers that were terminal. They were, they could be inside a green pod that was constricted and be tall. I mean, you could pick anything you wanted to mix and match, but it was always one from each trait on one particular plant. Before we can go much further into understanding what Mendel did, we need to look at how pea plants reproduce and how plants in general reproduce. And to understand that pea plant reproduction, we first need to understand that the flower of a plant is its reproductive structures. Okay, the flowers come in lots of shapes and sizes. Some are kind of little and small and dainty looking, some like a rose we're real familiar with. Some can be very ugly and not colorful at all. Others can have bright colors, but the reproductive organs of the plant are contained inside that flower. So the flower's purpose is for reproducing. Each flower is going to contain both a male and a female part. The male part is called the stamen, and it will produce the male gamete. And in plants, that male gamete is called pollen. So pollen is kind of the plant's equivalent to sperm. The flower, though, also contains a female part called the pistil, and the pistil produces the female gamete, which has the same basic name as in animals. So the female gamete is the egg. Kind of keep them apart. Always remember stamen has men at the end of it, so that's the male part of the flower. Here are some pictures of flowers. You notice that's actually my windowsill in my room. This is a plant that I had in my room and took some pictures of, bought it just so we could look at it. Can you see the parts growing in the center of these flowers? This large structure right in the middle of each flower, which has a sticky end on it, is the pistil. So that's the female part of the plant. And the eggs are way down at the bottom of that pistil. The smaller structures that kind of circle around the outside of the pistil are the stamens, and those big dark areas at the ends are actually where the pollen is produced. So the pollen from that flower would gradually get blown off by the wind or knocked off by an insect or whatever, and if it touches the pistil, because the pistil's sticky, the pollen would stick to it and grow a little tube down to the egg, and fertilization would take place. In pea plants and other plants, the plant will fertilize its own eggs with its own pollen, and that's called self-pollination. Typically, those are the ones that have smaller flowers, less colorful flowers. They don't have to have the pollen moved from one plant to another. That's also going to be, since you're pollinating its own flower, it's going to be asexual reproduction. And that means the offspring should be identical to the original plant. So, for example, with Mendel, if he had one of his plants that was tall and it self-pollinated, then the following year when he planted the seeds, and by the way, the seed is the pea, the following year when he planted the seed from that plant and let it grow, it's going to grow back into a tall plant. It's going to be exactly like the plant that it came from, asexual reproduction. So self-pollination is asexual reproduction. This is where Mendel started getting curious. every year he saw his plants that were tall produce more plants that were tall. He saw his plants that had green peas produce more green peas, and if he planted those green peas, it grew into plants with green peas, always producing exact copies. And he got to wondering what would happen if he forced his pea plants to have sex. What if he forced them to have sexual reproduction, which means not pollinating with pollen from the same flower, but rather from a different flower, and that's called cross-pollination, bringing the pollen from one to the pistil of another. To do that was very time-consuming, a very tedious job. He had to go into each individual flower and basically remove the male part. He had to remove the part that produced the pollen from every flower. So all those little stamens you saw growing around the pistil a minute ago, he would have had to go into the little tiny flowers of the pea plant and cut off those stamens in every single flower. That's to stop it from self-pollinating. And then to cross-pollinate, he would have to bring the pollen from a different plant. And he would do that with like a paintbrush. He would take the paintbrush and wipe it on the stamen of one plant and then take that paintbrush and dip it onto the pistil of the other. So let's just say he was going to cross a purple flowered plant with a white flowered plant. Again, first he would snip off the stamens. That's called emasculation, masculine, male. Okay, he's removing the stamens. Okay, and then he uses the paintbrush and paints the stamen of the purple flower with the pollen from the white flower. This group of plants, Mendel referred to as his parent plants. Mendel called this group of plants his parent plants. He felt like this was going to be the first group of parents that he would have. So he called them the P1, abbreviation for first parents. So obviously he thought there was going to be a second parent somewhere along the way, but there never was. Now, do keep in mind, while some plants do naturally pollinate, it's not what pea plants do. They typically self-pollinate, but Mendel forced them to sexually reproduce and cross-pollinate. When Mendel did this cross, it always was with the opposite trait. So he put purple with white, or he cross-pollinated a tall plant with a short plant, or one that had green seeds usually with one that had yellow seeds. He always crossed opposite plants. Okay, and he called their children, he called the plants that came from this cross, the F1 generation. The F here stands for the word filial. That's a word that hasn't stayed around in the language very much, but in Mendel's time, filial meant offspring. So basically, these are the first offspring, the first children of these parent plants. That's pretty cool. What do you think these children look like? If he crossed a tall plant with a short plant, what do you think he's going to get? Maybe some tall and some short? Maybe medium? We don't really know what Mendel expected to happen, but the guess is that he was probably surprised by what he found, because when he looked at the offspring from these plants, they all turned out exactly the same. Instead of getting some of each or something in between, he got them all exactly the same. So for example, when he crossed a tall plant with a short plant, when he cross-pollinated them, took the pollen from one to the other, every single one of the seeds that he planted from this tall-short cross turned out tall. Tall cross with short. Every single one of the F1 generation turned out tall. It was like it didn't matter that the short had even been there. The short one just seemed to not matter at all. And, maybe he thought it was because he had used the eggs from the tall and the pollen from the short. So he did it the other way. He used the eggs from the short and the pollen from the tall. They still all came out tall. And that probably confused Mendel. It would have confused me. I'd be lost as I could be. But whatever the situation was, Mendel didn't stop at that point. He then let those tall plants that he's made, he lets his F1 generation do their natural thing. He let the tall plants that he had grown just go ahead and self-pollinate. He let them go ahead and reproduce asexually. And we know that if something reproduces asexually, it's going to make exact copies. Well, Mendel let his tall plants cross with themselves. And he called this new generation the second offspring, or F2, the second filial F2. So we have our parent generation that he cross-pollinated. Their offspring is called the F1, the first offspring, the first filial. And he let them self-pollinate, and he let them produce offspring that was called the F2. Well, what do you think the F2 look like? We should know again that asexual reproduction, they should look exactly the same, but they didn't. An unusual situation has come about. Instead, three out of every four turned out like you would expect them to. Cross a tall with itself, you should get all tall. But 3 out of 4 do that. But 1/4 of the time, that short plant that seemed to have been lost the generation before showed back up. Now, to me, I wouldn't have known how to explain that. But Mendel was a lot smarter than me. Okay? And he was able to show why 3/4 of them turned out one way and 1/4 turned out the other. And it is from what he figured out that I'm getting ready to tell you right now that all of genetics is based on. From that experiment that he just did, Mendel concluded some real basic ideas that are the foundation of genetics. Number one, he said that the trait that's being passed to the offspring is being carried by something called a gene. Now, for generations, for many, many years, people had understood that parents give something to their offspring. You know, if I got a cow that gives a lot of milk, then there's a good chance that it will have babies that when they grow up will also give a lot of milk. Or black goats tend to produce more black goats. They understood that parents passed things to the offspring, but no one understood exactly what it was. Well, Mendel said that that's being passed by genes. And not only is a gene passed to the offspring, but genes must occur in pairs. So you don't just have one gene for your height, but rather you have 2 genes for your height. You don't have one gene for your hair color, you have 2 genes for your hair color. And they can be exactly the same or they could be different from each other. And that pair of genes is called alleles. A pair of genes are called alleles. The second thing that Mendel concluded was that when you're making the pollen, the egg, the sperm, when you're making the gametes, that both of those genes in the pair don't get passed to one gamete. Instead, they split up, and one gamete goes to one sperm, and one of the gametes goes to the other. So if you have 2 genes for hair color, one would go into one sperm, one would go into another. Or in the pea plant, one gene would go to one grain of pollen, one gene would go to the other grain of pollen, or to one egg and the other egg. So the genes separate and don't get passed together. That means one parent can't pass both genes. One gene has to come from each parent. And this is referred to as the law of segregation, one of Mendel's 2 main laws. The law of segregation says that the genes have to separate as they are passed. Each parent can only give one. The third thing that Mendel concluded in this is that since genes occur in pairs, that sometimes one gene has the ability to completely hide the other one, to block it out. So the gene that is able to block the other one out is said to be dominant. And the name of the one that is blocked out is said to be recessive.